Now, we will look at particularly how Kant defines morality, or what should be the source of morality in individual everyday practical situation or circumstances, by understanding his views on categorical or hypothetical imperative. So, Kant's conception of morality, as we have discussed, is a kind of a priori maxim which he calls categorical imperative. It is a priori in the sense that it is based on a kind of abstract principle that does not take into account or consideration the actual context of human existence or human being. So, this imperative in Kant is based on abstract principle that does not take into account any consideration of the actual circumstances in which human being lives. It is imperative in the sense that it is a command, a kind of order which is compulsory for the human being to follow. So, it obliges the rational and moral agent to behave and act in a particular manner. So, it is a priori, it is imperative that it forces or obliges the individual to act or behave in a particular manner in a particular circumstances, and it is categorical in the sense that it must be compulsorily, universally and unconditionally followed. So, that is the defining characteristic of a categorical imperative, that is, it is binding, it is compulsory, and it should be followed universally and unconditionally. There should not be any condition to follow the categorical imperative or the rules that is based on categorical imperative. So, as an imperative, it does not tell the individual exactly what to do in a given context. So, unlike any other commands or order which is very specific, shut the door, open the window, close the window, switch on the light. So, these are the command which is very specific, exactly tells other individual what to do. In contrast to that, categorical imperative is not something which is precise or exactly telling the individual what to do. It is basically a maxim, a kind of framework, a kind of principle using which individual as a rational moral agent will arrive at a particular action which they want others to follow universally and unconditionally. So, there is a kind of complex argument there in the categorical imperative, which is also universal and unconditional. So, instead, as an abstract maxim, as I said, it does not take into account any particular empirical circumstances of human living. It provides them with a formula to choose a particular course of action in a particular given context which they want others to follow in the same context without exception. Now, let us discuss this idea. Say, telling lies is not acceptable or morally acceptable at least, and yet we tend to speak lies if it is beneficial to us. Now, how we will arrive at a moral code that would be applied universally without any exception to us and also to others, and that is the whole idea of kingdom of ends in a way. So, it would be possible to argue that we speak lies if it is beneficial to us, but then we do not want others to speak lies, and that leads to conflicts. So, to avoid those conflicts and contradictions, the moral code that individual as a rational being should arrive at is based on the maxim that she wants others also to follow the same course of action which he or she is following in a particular given circumstances universally and unconditionally. That means, let us take the other example. So, in the exam you want to cheat or copy from others to secure more marks, but at the same time you do not want others to cheat or copy from others to get the more marks. So, there is a kind of moral contradictions here, but categorical imperative tells you to follow only those course of action which you want others to follow in that same circumstances universally and unconditionally. That means then speaking truth is better, treating others as an end in themselves is better, not cheating in the exam is better. That applies to you and you want it to be applied universally to others as well. So that's the whole basis of categorical imperative in a sense. So thus the characteristic of categorical imperative is its abstractness. It's not specific to any particular circumstances and yet it guides practical action. So it's abstract, it's general, universal and unconditional. So you subject your action, your practical activities to this reason without any condition. It wants the individual to act according to those principles through which you want others to guide their actions in a similar context universally and unconditionally. So that's the whole point of categorical imperative, that the moral code that you arrive at is specific to a particular context and yet it has universal application. So the legislation of moral code that is done by individual in a particular situation has its universal application at the same time. So there is a kind of this transcending the particular context to the universal community of individual. So thus categorically imperative according to Kant is not a moral law in itself. So in itself categorical imperative, as we have explained, is not telling the individual what to do in a particular context, but how they ought to do as a moral rational agent, that is acting according to the principle which you want others to follow in the same context universally across the context and unconditionally. So that's a kind of formula, that's a kind of maxim, but in itself it does not tell the individual what to do and what not to do. Individuals themselves decide what they should do on the condition that they want others to follow it also. In the the moral conflicts in life is, in economics we use the term free rider. We should pay the tax, but what if out of millions or billions 1 or 10% do not pay tax? It will not affect overall, but then if suppose in the millions 90% or 50% of the people will start thinking that in the similar way the free rider, what if rest of them should pay and I am not paying, so I will be the beneficiary of not paying the tax, but that 50-60% will create a devastating influence on the revenue of the government. Similarly in terms of voting, you should vote for electing your representative, but many voters think what if I do not vote, would it make any large difference? But if say 40-30% of enlightened or rational citizen refrain from voting, then you get the representative which you do not like most of the time. So this is a kind of guide to the practical condition by following this categorical imperative, which should not be contradictory within. It has to be morally consistent. That means you subject your practical activities on the principle which you want others to follow as well. You do not make exception for yourself or others while subjecting your practical action to a set of moral codes or a sense of obligation. So categorical imperative in itself is not a moral law. It only provides the framework through which individual as a rational agent develop for themselves what is their duty or an obligation to self and others. It is a maxim that enables free and autonomous moral agent to use it as the basis to guide their practical actions. So categorical imperative is not like utilitarianism as a philosophy that only those policies should be followed by the government which would be in the benefit of the maximum number of people. So in that sense, the categorical imperative is not a kind of consequentialist argument that the success of a policy or a rule is based on the consequences. The moral law should be just in itself. It does not require any further justification or justification on the basis of the consequences. So, in the Kantian ethics, what you have is, once you decide for yourself what is your duty, you ought to perform it without any consideration of its consequences. That is the moral law. That is how you lead a dignified life, and how it is possible to lead a happy life which would be peaceful or ever free from violence, conflicts and enviness. So, one has to follow categorical imperative regardless of the consequences, inclinations and feelings. So, all the feelings, inclinations and the consequences should be subjected to human reason and moral sense of duty. So, it helps the moral agent develop a sense of duty which she must perform or he must perform. This sense of duty among the free moral agent is based on the moral laws within and not from outside. So, thus Kant provide a kind of deontological, that is a science of morality, duty or ethics, foundation for the categorical imperative. So, there is no consequentialist justification for this imperative. Human being as a moral and rational agent remain free and autonomous by following laws legislated by themselves using this a priori maxim categorical imperative. And this he makes the argument of freedom similar to Rousseau, that by following the general will you will be free, and if you do not want to follow the general will, you will be forced to follow it, and thereby individual can be forced to be free in a sense. So, therefore, categorical imperative is to be followed by everyone universally and unconditionally, and this categorical imperative we can better understand by contrasting it with the hypothetical imperative. So, ethics and morality based on categorical imperative enables individuals to live a virtuous and happy life. So, remember the Greek philosophers, that what kind of life is a happy life? That kind of life is happy which is virtuous life. And what is virtue? Knowledge is virtue. And how you pursue knowledge? It is through reason. So, there is a kind of similar argument here in a way, but in a more complex manner, where you subject your reason to a set of codes or morality which you decide for yourself. So, to lead a happy life, one has to be virtuous. Without virtue, happiness or happy life is impossible to have, or even if you have it, it would not be permanent. So, to lead a kind of permanent happy life, one need to be virtuous, and to be virtuous one has to be moral, and that moral law then limits the reason and rationality, which otherwise lead to chaos or undesirable consequences for individual or also for the community. So, it is so as the codes of moral norms that guide their practical actions are based on categorical imperative which they themselves legislate, and these laws and codes are good in itself. It does not require any further external justification. So, using the categorical imperative on the basis of your reason and rationality, you arrive at a sense of duty or a sense of obligation which is good in itself regardless of its consequences. So, you ought to perform it without any consideration of its consequences. Now, let us contrast it with the hypothetical imperative, that is based on certain predetermined goals and objectives, and that is you see in the practical life most of the time. Human beings being rational, they first set certain goals and objectives, and then they guide their actions in a manner which help them to achieve those goals and objectives. So, that is the hypothetical imperative, very opposite of categorical imperative. In the hypothetical imperative, you already set certain goals and objectives and choose that course of action which helps you achieve those goals and objectives. So, in this sense, hypothetical imperative is conditional, not unconditional like categorical imperative. That is, the success of any course of action or failures of that action is based on the consequences of it. That is, whether that action help the individual to achieve or not to achieve the pre-desired goals and objectives. So, the hypothetical imperative would be conditional on the consequences of certain course of action. So, as a rational agent, using rationality and reason in the instrumental sense to achieve certain purpose which you decide beforehand, and then a particular course of action is good or bad, successful or a failure, depending upon whether it helps you to achieve that desire or pre-decided goals and objectives or not. So, that is the hypothetical imperative, and categorical imperative is very opposite of that. That means you set a set of objectives or a sense of duty which is good in itself. It does not require any further justification or any consideration of the consequences, and it is in a sense of truth, beauty, life, happiness, dignity and so on. It does not depend on the consequences of your action, but the law that you follow is good in itself regardless of the consequences. Hypothetical imperative is very different, that is dependent on the consequences. So, one of the philosophy that we have discussed, utilitarian philosophy, is the best example of hypothetical imperative, that is that course of law and public policies would be follow which would be in the maximum benefit of maximum number. So, it depends, and the justification for that course of action is the consequences of that action. So, the external objects or consequences of one's actions are the legitimizing ground for hypothetical imperative. So, whether a course of action is right or wrong depends on its ability to achieve certain pre-decided goals and objectives. According to Kant, hypothetical imperative may lead to conflicts and enviousness among the people, because suppose if, as I have given the example of free rider, while paying the tax or while going for voting, it may create conflicts, it may create enviousness in the society, whereas categorical imperative would create a condition or create a society where everyone would follow a code of law which would be just in itself. It would be applicable to everyone in the similar context unconditionally and universally, and that would be a society of perpetual peace without violence, conflict or enviousness among its inhabitants. So, hypothetical imperative then could not lead to permanent peace or happiness either for the individual or for the society. So, as an individual using your hypothetical imperative or using your reason, you may get some instant satisfaction, but it may not give you permanent satisfaction or permanent happiness. You may repent later, or you may develop a sense of guilt. While doing it, you may have certain satisfaction, but then after doing it, you develop some sense of guilt. So, there is a kind of innate moral sense of just and unjustness in human being, and human being must subject reason, rationality, practical actions, behavior, desire and passion to a certain code of duty and obligation to self and others, and that they can do on the basis of categorical imperative, not on hypothetical imperative. So, according to Kant, categorical imperative being good in itself and free from the condition, it is not on the basis of any conditionalities, could lead to lasting peace and happiness within the self and also among others in the society or community.